To understand why that brief moment felt so unsettling, it is necessary to step back into the world these women came from. From a moment the National Socialist regime took power in 1933, the role of women in Germany was sharply defined and carefully controlled. The state did not simply encourage certain behaviors. It embedded them into law, propaganda, education, and daily life. Womanhood was not a personal identity. It was a national function. The Nazi ideal of femininity revolved around three words repeated endlessly in speeches, posters, and classrooms: Kinder, Kusch, Kirche, children, kitchen, church. Women were celebrated not for independence or expression, but for obedience, fertility, and sacrifice. Their value was measured in births, not choices. Even when war expanded their responsibilities, the ideological frame never changed. Public behavior mattered deeply. A woman's appearance in the street was seen as a reflection of the state itself. Smoking, especially in public, was discouraged and increasingly stigmatized. The regime framed it as unhealthy, unfeminine, and morally weak. Anti-smoking campaigns were widespread in Nazi Germany, often targeting women directly. Posters warned that smoking endangered motherhood. Medical journals linked it to racial decline. Female smokers were portrayed as careless, selfish, or influenced by foreign decadence. This was not merely health policy. It was cultural discipline. Young German girls absorbed these norms early. Through the Bund Deutscher Mädel, the League of German Girls, they were trained in physical fitness, domestic preparation, and ideological loyalty. They learned how to walk, how to dress, how to behave in public. They learned restraint. They learned that a woman's body was not her own, but a vessel for the nation. As war approached, these expectations hardened rather than loosened. Even as men were sent to the front and labor shortages grew severe, the regime resisted granting women true autonomy. Instead, it framed necessity as duty. Women were mobilized into auxiliary roles: signals, administration, nursing, logistics, but always under strict moral oversight. Uniforms were modest. Conduct was monitored. Relationships were regulated. The message remained constant. Participation did not mean freedom. It meant service. By the early 1940s, hundreds of thousands of German women were embedded in the war machine. They worked in air defense units, staffed offices of the Wehrmacht, assisted in hospitals, and supported occupation forces. Some were posted far from home. Others lived close to the front. Yet even in these spaces shaped by violence and urgency, the boundaries of acceptable female behavior remained rigid. Smoking openly, laughing loudly, displaying casual confidence. These were markers of moral failure in the world they knew. Such behavior was associated with moral decay, foreign influence, or social breakdown. It was something to be corrected, not imitated. This ideological framework did not disappear when bombs fell on German cities. It traveled with these women into the final months of the war. It shaped how they understood themselves even as the Reich began to fracture around them. And when that structure finally collapsed in 1945, it left behind not only physical ruin, but millions of people still carrying its rules inside them, unprepared for the world that was about to confront them beyond the wire. By the beginning of 1945, the world these women had known was already dissolving. Germany was retreating on every front. In the West, Allied armies crossed the Rhine. In the East, Soviet forces advanced relentlessly toward Berlin. Cities lay in ruins. Transport networks had collapsed. Civil administration barely functioned. What remained of the Nazi state existed more in paperwork and slogans than in real control. As Allied forces moved forward, they encountered not only soldiers but vast numbers of displaced civilians and non-combatant personnel. Among them were German women who had served the regime in auxiliary capacities. Some were attached to military units. Others worked in communication centers, supply offices, or hospitals. Many had been evacuated hastily as fronts collapsed. Few had clear instructions. Almost none had a plan for what came next. Capture often came quietly. In villages, rail yards, and improvised headquarters, these women were taken into Allied custody. Unlike frontline combatants, they were not processed as enemy fighters in the traditional sense. Most were classified as prisoners, internees, or disarmed enemy personnel. Their treatment varied depending on location, nationality of the capturing force, and the chaotic conditions of the final weeks of the war. They were gathered into temporary holding camps, barbed wire enclosures set up in former fields, depots, or outskirts of towns. These camps were not extermination centers or punishment zones. They were spaces of waiting. Food was basic. Shelter was improvised. Rules were posted in unfamiliar languages. Days passed without clear information. For many of these women, this was their first sustained exposure to Allied authority and to Allied society. The Guard were often young men from Britain, the United States, Canada, or France. Their manner was different from what the prisoners expected. Orders were given, but not shouted. Violence was rare. There was a noticeable absence of ideological language. No salutes, no slogans, no lectures about destiny or sacrifice. Beyond the camps, civilian life continued. Allied occupation forces did not seal off towns entirely. Roads remained open. Local populations moved about. In some areas, civilians from liberated countries passed near German holding areas. In others, German civilians under Allied supervision resumed daily routines under new rules. It was in these transitional spaces between war and peace, between captivity and release, that the cultural shock occurred. German female prisoners observed something they had not been prepared to see. Women walking unaccompanied. Women speaking directly to male soldiers without deference. Women wearing trousers. Women laughing openly in public places. And, most strikingly, women smoking cigarettes without fear of reprimand. To Allied civilians, this behavior was unremarkable. In Britain and the United States, women smoking publicly had become increasingly common since the interwar years. During the war, it had spread further. Cigarettes were part of daily life. They were rations, comforts, social tools. Women worked in factories, drove vehicles, and served in uniformed auxiliaries of their own. Their presence in public space had expanded, and so had their autonomy. For the German prisoners, this was not simply unfamiliar. It contradicted years of moral instruction. They were seeing women who embodied a different relationship with authority. No visible shame, no correction, no ideological framing. Just ordinary freedom expressed in small, visible acts. The realization did not arrive as anger or protest. It came as silence, as observation, as internal recalibration. The war had taught them to fear Allied weapons. But here, in the aftermath, it was Allied normalcy that unsettled them most. The discipline they had carried for years suddenly felt unnecessary, and that recognition carried a weight more difficult to process than defeat itself. That tension between learned restraint and observed freedom would become the center of their psychological reckoning. And it opens the way to examine this moment from multiple angles, each revealing a different layer of what was truly happening behind the wire. For the women standing behind the wire, the experience was not dramatic in the way battles are dramatic. There was no noise, no movement of troops, no threat, and yet the effect was deeply personal. Human identity is shaped by boundaries, by what is permitted and what is forbidden. For years, these women had lived within a narrow moral corridor. They had internalized rules so thoroughly that they no longer felt imposed. They felt natural. Smoking in public was not simply discouraged. It was something a proper woman would not even consider. When they saw allied women smoking openly, the reaction was not immediate rebellion. It was disorientation. If this was allowed, if it was normal, then what else had been misrepresented? The realization did not demand answers. It planted doubt. Some women later recalled that the shock came not from the act itself, but from the ease surrounding it. No tension, no apology, no attempt to hide. The cigarette was held casually, as if it carried no meaning at all. That absence of meaning was what unsettled them most. This moment forced an internal confrontation. Their sense of moral superiority, carefully cultivated by years of propaganda, began to fracture. The world outside the fence did not appear decadent or collapsing. It appeared functional, calm, confident. In that comparison, their own rigid restraint suddenly felt imposed rather than virtuous. Nazi Germany had promoted a vision of womanhood rooted in sacrifice and control. Allied societies, particularly Britain and the United States, had moved, unevenly but visibly, toward broader female participation in public life. By 1945, these differences were no longer abstract. They were observable. Public smoking became a symbol because it was visible and irreversible. Once seen, it could not be unseen. It represented a woman occupying public space without permission, without explanation, without justification. In German society, public female behavior had been policed not only by the state, but by neighbors, families, and peers. Conformity was collective. Deviation carried social consequences. In Allied societies, especially during wartime, those mechanisms were weaker. Women had filled factories, offices, and transport roles. They had claimed space through necessity and kept it through habit. For the prisoners, this contrast suggested something unsettling. That discipline did not automatically produce strength, and that freedom did not automatically lead to decay. The cultural narrative they had been taught began to lose coherence. Ideology survives through repetition and isolation. It weakens when exposed to contradiction. The Third Reich had spent 12 years insulating its citizens from alternative models of life. Foreign cultures were portrayed as corrupt or inferior. Yet in 1945, the collapse of borders exposed German prisoners to the everyday reality of those same societies. This exposure was not orchestrated. There were no lectures, no re-education programs in this moment. Just observation. And observation was enough. The sight of women smoking publicly did not overthrow ideology in an instant, but it marked a crack, a visible, undeniable inconsistency between what had been preached and what now stood plainly in view. The women behind the wire were not yet ready to articulate this shift, but had begun. And beyond the human and cultural layers, there were deeper structural forces at work. How power, victory, and normal life express themselves without force. For Allied personnel, German female prisoners were an unfamiliar category. They were not combatants in the traditional sense. They carried no weapons. Many were young. Some were visibly exhausted. They represented a defeated system more than an active threat. Allied doctrine did not frame these women as ideological targets in the moment. Guards were instructed to maintain order, not to humiliate or instruct. Civilian life continued around the camps because there was no perceived need to hide it. The Allies had won. Normality itself became a statement. This lack of deliberate messaging was significant. No one arranged for German prisoners to see women smoking publicly. It happened naturally, as part of an open society resuming daily rhythms. And that unintentional exposure made the contrast more powerful than any formal propaganda could have achieved. The absence of hostility was disarming. Power expressed quietly, through confidence rather than force, created a form of psychological imbalance. The prisoners were confronted not by aggression, but by a way of life that did not require justification. Cigarettes carried layered meaning during the war. They were currency, comfort, and ritual. For soldiers, they marked pauses between danger. For civilians, they marked continuity in disrupted lives. For women, especially in Allied societies, smoking had gradually become associated with autonomy. It was not universal, and it was still contested, but it was visible, and visibility mattered. In Nazi Germany, the regime's anti-smoking stance toward women was tied to biological policy. Female bodies were regulated as national assets. In contrast, Allied women smoking publicly signaled that their bodies were not under state ownership in the same way. The act itself was small, but its implications were large. It suggested choice, leisure, control over one's own image. To the German prisoners, raised in a system that equated discipline with virtue, this signaled a different moral economy, one where worth was not measured by restriction. Military victory ends wars. Cultural influence shapes what follows. In 1945, the Allies did not need to assert dominance through spectacle. The presence of open, functioning societies in liberated areas spoke for itself. Markets reopened. Cafes resumed service. Women and men occupied public space without ritualized hierarchy. The prisoners observed this from the margins. And from that position, they saw something crucial: power that did not demand submission, authority that did not rely on fear. This was a turning point not because it was planned, but because it was organic. The collapse of Nazi ideology did not occur solely in tribunals or re-education halls. It occurred in moments like this, when everyday life contradicted years of indoctrination. And as these observations accumulated, they prepared the ground for a deeper psychological shift, one that would reach its peak when defeat became undeniable not just in military terms, but in moral ones. That shift brings us to the decisive internal climax of this story. The decisive moment did not arrive with an announcement. It arrived quietly over days. As the weeks passed after Germany's surrender in May 1945, the temporary camps became places of prolonged observation. The women were no longer stunned by explosions or air raids. Instead, they were left with time, long hours of waiting, watching, and thinking. Outside the wire, Allied life did not retreat. It stabilized. Supply trucks rolled through towns. Civilian transport resumed. Shops reopened with limited stock. Women appeared regularly in public spaces, no longer driven by emergency, but by routine. They walked to work. They queued for food. They met friends. Some smoked while they waited. Others leaned against walls, relaxed, unguarded. For the German prisoners, repetition was crucial. One sight could be dismissed as anomaly, a second as coincidence. But when the pattern repeated day after day, the mind could no longer defend itself with excuses. This was not chaos. This was order of a different kind. The prisoners began to notice subtler details. Allied women spoke directly to soldiers without lowered eyes. They did not step aside reflexively. They negotiated, argued, laughed. Authority flowed both ways. Respect was not enforced through posture or silence. These observations forced an internal reckoning. For years, the German women had believed they lived in a morally superior society, more disciplined, more purposeful, more healthy. Now they were seeing a defeated enemy whose women appeared calmer, freer, and unashamed. The contradiction could no longer be ignored. This was the turning point, not because anyone told them they were wrong, but because reality refused to support what they had been taught. The war had promised moral clarity, victory through discipline, strength through control. Instead, defeat arrived alongside a visible alternative that seemed neither weak nor decayed. Some prisoners reacted with denial. They insisted this behavior was temporary, that it reflected wartime breakdown, not true values. Others grew inwardly defensive, retreating into silence. But for many, something deeper occurred. They began to separate the regime from themselves. This psychological shift was subtle but profound. It marked the moment when loyalty transformed into distance, when obedience gave way to evaluation, when belief loosened its grip. And once that process began, it could not be reversed. Because the longer they watched, the clearer it became that this world, so different from their own, had not collapsed under its freedoms. It had survived the war. That realization, once fully absorbed, would reshape how these women understood not only the enemy, but themselves. As the days stretched into weeks, the internal shift became visible in small, almost imperceptible ways. The women began to speak differently among themselves. Conversations that once repeated official phrases now softened. Certainties turned into questions. The language of duty gave way to the language of confusion. No one made speeches. No one declared ideological surrender. But the tone changed. They compared memories. Some recalled being reprimanded for minor violations of conduct. An unbuttoned coat, laughter in the wrong place, a cigarette hidden and extinguished too quickly. Others remembered lectures delivered in schools or youth organizations warning that foreign habits would weaken women and, through them, the nation. Those memories now felt distant, almost theatrical, when measured against what they were seeing daily. The most unsettling realization was not that they had lost the war. It was that they had lived inside a narrow version of life without realizing alternatives existed. Defeat, in this sense, became layered. There was the military defeat, visible in the absence of German authority. There was the political defeat, confirmed by occupation and dismantling of institutions. And there was the personal defeat, the recognition that obedience had been demanded not for protection, but for control. For some women, this produced anger, not toward the Allies, but toward the system that had limited them while promising meaning. For others, it produced grief. Years spent conforming could not be recovered. Youth defined by restraint could not be relived. The sight of Allied women smoking publicly continued to act as a quiet reference point. It was no longer shocking. It was explanatory. It symbolized a broader truth, that behavior framed as immoral or dangerous could, in fact, coexist with stability, dignity, and social order. At this point, the turning was complete. The prisoners were no longer simply observing a foreign society. They were reevaluating their own past through it. The ideological walls that had once shaped their identity no longer felt permanent. They felt constructed. This did not mean immediate transformation. Belief systems do not dissolve overnight. But the foundation had cracked. And once cracked, it could not support the same weight. When the women were eventually informed of their impending release or transfer, sometimes weeks, sometimes months later, they carried with them more than memories of captivity. They carried a recalibrated understanding of authority, gender, and freedom. That understanding would shape how they responded to re-education programs, to denazification questionnaires, and to the rebuilding of civilian life in post-war Germany. And with release came consequences, not just for individuals, but for a society struggling to redefine itself after collapse. Those consequences unfolded slowly in the aftermath that followed. Release did not arrive as liberation in the dramatic sense. For most German female prisoners, freedom came gradually. Names were checked. Papers were issued. Camp populations thinned as individuals were transferred, repatriated, or simply told they could leave. There were no celebrations, only movement. They returned to a country that scarcely resembled the one they had left. Cities were broken landscapes of brick and ash. Housing was scarce. Food was rationed. Families were fragmented by death, displacement, or silence. The state that had once dictated behavior down to the smallest gesture no longer existed in recognizable form. Under Allied occupation, Germany entered a period of enforced reckoning. Denazification programs assessed individual responsibility. Questionnaires asked about party membership, organizational involvement, and wartime roles. For many women, these forms marked the first time they were asked to define themselves independently of slogans or collective identity. The psychological shift that had begun behind the wire now became practical. Women who had served in auxiliary roles often minimized their involvement, sometimes out of fear, sometimes out of genuine reassessment. Others expressed confusion rather than loyalty. The confidence once projected by the regime had evaporated, replaced by uncertainty. Allied authorities noted these reactions in reports. While men were often evaluated through the lens of military service, women were assessed more ambiguously. Their wartime contributions were real, but their ideological commitment varied widely. This ambiguity allowed space for adaptation. Exposure to Allied norms continued beyond captivity. In occupied zones, German civilians encountered new social models daily. Women worked alongside occupation personnel. They interacted with foreign administrators. They saw different patterns of authority and gender relations repeated, normalized, and institutionalized. Re-education initiatives reinforced these observations. Films, publications, and public discussions presented alternative narratives, not only about politics, but about social life. The aim was not to humiliate, but to prevent repetition. For women who had already experienced ideological dissonance during captivity, these efforts found fertile ground. The shock they felt earlier now matured into reflection. Public behavior slowly changed. Clothing became more practical. Movement in public space grew less constrained. While smoking among German women did not become immediately widespread, the stigma attached to it weakened. The act no longer carried the same moral charge. More importantly, the internal policing of female behavior began to erode. Neighbors watched less. Judgment softened. Survival took priority over symbolism. Yet this transformation was uneven and fragile. Many women struggled to reconcile their past with their present. Guilt mixed with resentment. Freedom mixed with fear. The old discipline had offered clarity, even if it was oppressive. The new world offered choice, but also responsibility. These tensions did not disappear quickly. They carried forward into the Reconstruction years, shaping how German women understood themselves in a society being rebuilt under foreign influence. And as Germany moved from occupation toward redefinition, the long-term effects of these shifts became visible, both in policy and in daily life. As the late 1940s unfolded, the changes that had begun quietly became structural. In West Germany, political reconstruction brought with it a redefinition of citizenship. The new constitutional framework emphasized individual rights over collective duty. Equality before the law, including gender equality, was formally acknowledged, if not immediately realized in practice. The language of the state changed, and with it, expectations of personal behavior. For women who had lived under rigid ideological supervision, this shift was profound. Public life no longer revolved around prescribed roles. Economic necessity pushed women into the workforce in large numbers. Offices, factories, and shops depended on female labor. With this visibility came normalization. Women in public space ceased to be symbolic carriers of national morality and became participants in daily survival and recovery. Cultural influence from allied nations intensified. Films, magazines, and consumer goods entered German markets. They carried images of women that contrasted sharply with those promoted during the Third Reich. Confidence replaced restraint. Individuality replaced uniformity. Smoking, once a moral marker, became simply a habit, adopted by some, rejected by others, but no longer policed as a national issue. What had shocked German prisoners in 1945 became, within a generation, unremarkable. In East Germany, changes followed a different path, but reached similar conclusions. State socialism promoted female participation in labor as ideological necessity. While control remained, it took new forms. Women occupied public roles openly, and behavior was framed around productivity rather than morality. Across both German states, the legacy of wartime gender control faded. For the women who had stood behind the wire in 1945, the memory of that first encounter often remained vivid, not because of the cigarette itself, but because of what it represented, a sudden, undeniable contrast between two worlds. Historians studying post-war adaptation have noted how small, everyday observations often triggered larger psychological shifts. Defeat does not always announce itself through treaties. Sometimes it arrives through ordinary life continuing without you. The Allied victory reshaped borders, governments, and economies. But it also reshaped assumptions. It challenged ideas about authority, discipline, and gender that had once seemed immutable. The shock these women felt was not a sign of weakness. It was evidence of how thoroughly ideology can shape perception, and how fragile that shaping becomes once reality intrudes. As Germany rebuilt, those early moments of exposure contributed to a broader, quieter transformation, one that unfolded not in courtrooms or parades, but in streets, workplaces, and everyday decisions. And from that quiet transformation emerges a final reflection on what this moment reveals about power, freedom, and the ways wars truly end. History often remembers wars in terms of battles, borders, and treaties. Yet sometimes the most profound shifts occur in silence, in moments so ordinary that they almost go unnoticed. The women who stood behind the wire in 1945 witnessed a world that refused their expectations. A cigarette, held casually by a stranger, became a quiet agent of revelation. It carried no order, no command, no ideology, yet it conveyed something far deeper: autonomy, choice, and resilience. In that act, the boundaries of the world they had known dissolved, leaving them to confront not only the defeat of a nation, but the collapse of a moral universe carefully constructed over decades. This encounter reminds us that power is not always enforced through force. Sometimes it is lived, embodied, and observed. Freedom, expressed in small, daily gestures, can unsettle more profoundly than any weapon. The Allied women were not conquerors in uniform. They were agents of normalcy, demonstrating through ordinary life that stability and dignity can coexist with independence. For the German prisoners, the experience was unsettling, disorienting, and ultimately instructive. It reshaped how they understood authority, morality, and themselves. In the decades that followed, as Germany reconstructed and redefined its society, these lessons rippled outward, subtly influencing gender norms, social behavior, and cultural attitudes. Wars end on battlefields, but their echoes extend far beyond. Sometimes history pivots on a quiet act, a pause, a cigarette held in public, A reminder that human understanding and societal change often emerge not through command, but through observation, reflection, and the simple assertion of choice.